Stop me if you've heard this one before. The President of the United States might be obstructing justice in plain sight again. Donald Trump revealing in an interview today with the New York Post that a pardon for convicted felon and one-time Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort is, quote, not off the table. A pardon for Manafort might strengthen an obstruction of justice case against the president if the special counsel could show that the pardon was intended to impede the investigation or assure Manafort that he could lie to the FBI even after agreeing to cooperate. It's most certainly a line of inquiry that the special counsel is actively pursuing at this hour. Today's comments come after we learned last night from the New York Times that lawyers for Paul Manafort have been feeding Donald Trump a steady stream of information about special counsel Robert Mueller. Information that's likely been loaded into Donald Trump's fragile psyche and weaponized in the public relations war against that investigation. The Times reports on an alliance and information sharing agreement between Paul Manafort's lawyer and the president's legal team that continued even after Paul Manafort entered into a cooperation agreement with the special counsel. The Times reports, quote, the arrangement inflamed tensions with the special counsel's office when prosecutors discovered it after Mr. Manafort began cooperating 2 months ago. Some legal experts speculated that it was a bid by Manafort for a presidential pardon, even as he worked with the special counsel Robert Mueller in hopes of a lighter sentence. We also learned from the Times what Mueller's team is probing, at least according to Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Quote, Giuliani said Manafort's lawyer, Kevin Downing, told him that prosecutors hammered away at whether the president knew about the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting, where Russians promised to deliver damaging information on Hillary Clinton to his eldest son, Donald Trump Jr. The president has long denied knowing about the meeting in advance. Quote, he wants Manafort to incriminate Trump, Mr. Giuliani declared of Mr. Mueller. Here to take us through this reporting, one of the reporters who broke that story, as well as some of our favorite reporters and friends. From the New York Times, Mike Schmidt. From the Washington Post, senior political reporter Aaron Blake. Former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance is here, and with us at the table, Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the AP. Let's first, though, head over to NBC's Kristen Welker, who has breaking news about Donald Trump's written answers to Robert Mueller. Kristen Welker.
Hi there, Nicole. Well, according to two sources who I just spoke with, President Trump, as a part of his written answers to special counsel Robert Mueller, told Mueller that he didn't know about that 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Don Jr. and a Russian attorney before it happened, and that he didn't know about those WikiLeaks from Roger Stone, that he wasn't informed about that. Now, again, this is according to two sources familiar with the matter. This was reported by another news outlet earlier today, but we have, in fact, confirmed that reporting. According to these sources with whom I spoke, Nicole, I am told that the questions that President Trump answered all related to Russia. In other words, not related to the issue of obstruction. Those sources telling me the president answered those questions to the best of his recollection. These sources also confirming that news that the New York Times broke that I know you're going to delve into with Mike moments from now, but that news that, in fact, they have been updated by Paul Manafort's legal team. And adding to that, something that our Anna Schechter broke shortly ago, which is that they've also been updated by the legal team of Jerome Corsi. They have joint defense agreements with both. So some significant developments here, of course, coming on the heels of what we learned yesterday, that Paul Manafort's plea deal with the special counsel has deteriorated, has broken down amidst allegations that he lied. Those are allegations that he denies. But looming over all of this, will the president pardon Paul Manafort? The president himself not taking that option off the table. And I spoke with his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, earlier today, who underlined that, saying that, look, there has been no discussion of a pardon, but he's not taking anything off the table, Nicole.
Kristen Welker, anything in that interview with Rudy Giuliani or any of the sources about the president's responses that pointed you toward any areas where maybe he didn't answer, where he left them blank or refused to fill in, to the best of his recollection, his responses?
It's a really important question, Nicole, and my sources wouldn't delve into any more details beyond those two subject matters. But here's what I can tell you, having had these conversations over the past several days, if not weeks. The president's legal team is expecting some follow-up questions from the special counsel. So I think that goes to your point. Is it possible that some of these answers that President Trump gave may have left some room for follow-ups, for some more information? I think that would not be unlikely. The president's legal team expecting to hear back from the special counsel, Robert Mueller. They are hoping within a week or so. But of course, the special counsel's team is going to take its time and read through those answers very carefully, Nicole.
Kristen, Welker, thank you so much for spending some time with us and for that reporting. We're grateful.
Thanks.
Joyce, Vance, can you jump in? Obviously, the topic's not surprising, but the president's response is equally unsurprising. I don't think anyone thought he would say, oh, yeah, I was in New York the day of the Trump Tower meeting. I was at a fundraiser with my pal Chris Christie, but on my way back, I swung through and said, hey, to the Russians promising dirt on Hillary. No one thought that was going to be a disclosure that he would offer.
Rudy Giuliani had said all along that the president's responses to the written questions would be consistent with his public statements. And of course, he has always denied collusion and knowledge, leaving aside whether or not he's just thrown his firstborn under the bus by saying that only his firstborn was aware of the arrangements for the Trump Tower meeting. What Trump has done is he has locked himself in after a fashion. Sure, there's a qualifier on these questions, to the best of my recollection, which, as we all know, leaves a little bit of room to hedge. But if Mueller's got phone records showing that there were communications between Trump Jr. and the then candidate Trump as they were arranging the meetings with Russians, or if there's other sorts of documentary evidence that confirms Trump's whereabouts and location during some of these events, if there are, for instance, emails or recorded recollection or even recordings of calls between Roger Stone and the president discussing emails, all of these pieces come into sharper focus now that Mueller has his hands on Trump's written responses.
Mike Schmidt, take us through what you and your colleagues have reported last night about the president's flow of information from Manafort's lawyers, even after Manafort had agreed to cooperate. And I guess a non-lawyer would assume that meant be helpful to the Mueller probe. That wasn't the case.
Yeah, so there was a pipeline from Kevin Downing, Manafort's lawyer, to Rudy Giuliani. And this really helped give the president's legal team insight into what was going on. And this also helped, certainly led to the president becoming agitated. The president knew that the prosecutors were really hammering on Manafort, and specifically on the question of the Trump Tower meeting. What did they were going to Manafort and saying, what did the president know about this? Did he know about it before? Did he know about it afterwards? And what Giuliani says is that when they got answers from Manafort that they didn't like, when Manafort said he didn't know anything about this, they put him back in solitary confinement and kept him there for 4 days. It's not the prosecutor's decision to keep him there. It was a decision the jail made. But Giuliani making it seem like there was an enormous amount of effort being used by the special counsel's office to get Manafort to incriminate the president.
Mike Schmidt, let me ask you about pardons, and let me read you something the president said this afternoon to the New York Post. This is the president, quote, you know, this flipping stuff is terrible. You flip and you lie and you the prosecutors will tell you 99% of the time they can get people to flip. It's rare that they can't, Trump said, but I had 3 people, Manafort, Corsi, I don't know Corsi, but he refuses to say what they demanded, Manafort, Corsi, and Roger Stone. It's actually very brave, he said, of that trio. And I'm telling you, this is McCarthyism. We are in the McCarthy era. This is no better than McCarthy. And that was a bad situation for the country, but this is where we are, and it's a terrible thing. This is, I guess, his feelings about these 3 targets of the Mueller probe. But this also seems to be in line with something you and your colleagues have reported about softening the ground for what may be their next legal move in a public relations fight. Do you hear that as softening the ground for pardons for all 3 of those men?
Well, it's unclear if, look, the president's talking about pardons. They've talked about pardons before. He says he hasn't talked about it in private. He has talked about it in private. The interesting thing I find in all this is that the president does have a big interest in undermining cooperators. Think about who's cooperated. His personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, his former deputy campaign chairman, Manafort as well. So there's a lot of people around the president who knew a lot of things that were going on during the campaign that have been flipped. And this has been a theme of his since Manafort was flipped early, months ago. they are rats. You know, he would call Michael Cohen a rat, and he would criticize this process, saying that the Justice Department overuses its power to get these folks to say things that the Justice Department wants them to say, even though they're not true. And you can hear the drumbeat of that in his efforts to undermine it.
Joyce, let me bring you back in. It's weird to the ear to hear the President of the United States, someone who sits atop the executive branch of government and ostensibly atop the Justice Department, accuse people cooperating with a federal investigation, people who have committed crimes. The only reason you flip is if you're guilty of something and it may be a road to a more lenient sentence or some leniency for someone you care about, I guess, in the case of Mike Flynn.
I think weird to the ear is a very kind characterization of what the president is doing here. You know, there are criminal defendants all over this country who are excited to hear the president's characterization of flipping is wrong. I'm sure defense lawyers all over America are going to be arguing it to juries at some point within the next couple of months. The reality is that this president is making the effort to undermine the American justice system in order to benefit himself. And it becomes normal. We sit around and we're all talking about the fact that the President of the United States has a joint defense agreement with 32 other individuals. They're all under investigation for federal crimes. And somehow that's becoming normal. And we have to resist that urge and keep it from becoming normal, because it's not. The president's job is to sit atop the executive branch and uphold the work of the Justice Department in keeping all of us safe. What he's doing is making all of us less safe every day.
Aaron Blake, you had one of my favorite pieces of analysis about what Mike and his colleagues reported, and I'll just put up the headline and let you explain. Giuliani's bizarre bragging about Manafort-Trump alliance raises new obstruction questions. Take us through your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I thought, you know, obviously the first two paragraphs of Mike's story were great and news breaking and all those things. We get to paragraphs 3 and 4, and what we get is Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, not just confirming this arrangement that is highly unusual and perhaps ethically questionable, but actually bragging about it in a lot of ways. He almost seemed to be needling Robert Mueller and saying, hey, look what we pulled over on you. The fact that he said they were getting strategic information from these conversations between the two legal teams. He's basically saying that this was a fruitful arrangement for them strategically that they used to inform their public strategy and their legal strategy. That's a remarkable admission, and I think that there are a number of legal experts, former federal prosecutors, talking about whether something like this could amount to some kind of an obstruction of justice. That would require for this to be a quid pro quo, some kind of an arrangement in which Paul Manafort was installed as an informant in some ways inside the Mueller investigation by reaching that plea agreement. We don't know whether that's actually the case. But the fact that the president's lawyer is basically out there talking about how this was such a fruitful circumstance for them to have Paul Manafort inside telling them what was going on, I think is a rather remarkable set of circumstances, and I commend Mike for the excellent reporting and getting that on the record.
Mike, can you jump in on that and just pick up on the idea that sometimes your analysis when you come on is that they do these things in plain sight. It must not be as bad as it sounds, or that which would have constituted obstruction of justice in the Nixon era, if it was on a tape that was revealed through an investigation, because they do it on Twitter, because they say it in quotes to your paper or Aaron's. I don't know, maybe it's a question mark. This seems to some people like open and shut obstruction if the intent of Manafort's lying to Mueller was to continue to feed information back to Trump's legal defense team.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing from Giuliani looks like the second wave of an attack on Mueller. So Giuliani comes on in the spring, all summer long, launching these attacks to undermine Mueller. Giuliani got quiet during the month before the election, and now is back at it, really hitting the gas and trying to do what he did before, a similar version, throw a lot of different stuff at the wall, say a lot of different things, make it very confusing for the average person. They still think they're playing the game of public opinion. They believe public opinion will dictate whether the House of Representatives would be willing to, impeach the president, and they believe the more confusing it is, the muddier the water is, the more successful the president will be. And when you look at what Giuliani's done in the past few days, it's very similar to the tactic they took earlier this year.
Jonathan Lemire, it leaves the question, though, it gets easier and easier to answer. Why, other than a promise or suggestion that a pardon was imminent? And Manafort, I believe, was offered a pardon before. I think Mike and his colleagues reported on the president's last lawyer, John Doe, maybe 3 lawyers ago, dangling pardons in front of Mike Flynn and in front of Paul Manafort, I think before they were charged. So pardons have been in the water. What other motive would Manafort have for lying to Mueller?
Well, I spoke to Giuliani as well, and he said, to back up the reporting here about the pardons, he said it's not an active consideration, that the president and his legal team are not considering it now, but yeah, they're not ruling it out down the road, perhaps after this process with the Mueller probe wraps up. I think they understand how politically problematic a pardon might be right now. It would be throwing a stick of dynamite in the middle of it.
What makes it better in a month?
Well, I mean, I think the presumption is it would be something they'd revisit after the Mueller probe was over, not something they would do now. But of course, Manafort would potentially, we would assume, still be facing state charges on some of these tax crimes and financial fraud, that even if the president were to grant him a federal pardon, that state prosecutors in New York or Virginia, let's say, could then go after him. But to Mike's point, is exactly right, is that Giuliani has clearly, they're trying to undermine the credibility of whatever testimony is coming. Some of these details we'll probably find out in the sentencing agreement when Manafort is sentenced, those documents that Mueller, who of course doesn't speak publicly, but those details were revealed in the sentencing documents, that he told me when I spoke to him that he accused that Andrew Weissman, one of Mueller's top lieutenants, was keeping Manafort in solitary confinement for almost the entire day, as sort of they were trying to pressure him to flipping on the president, to say things that were untrue. Now, of course, there's no sense that that's happening at all. Giuliani did not provide any evidence to back that up, which is not a new refrain for him whatsoever. But it shows that they're once again they're ratcheting up the attacks here on Mueller as they feel like the next steps in this probe are imminent.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.